Phillips does not seem to have had any dealings with Islam, but he went on having visions all his life. For more than half a century he labored to reunite the provinces of Canterbury and York with the Patriarchate of Rome. He was always a romantic. His methods of seeking to achieve reunion were true to his character. This can be seen from his correspondence with John Roos Bloxham, 1807 to 1891, a Fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, a friend of most of the leaders of the Tractarian movement, and the father or grandfather of all ritualistics, as Lord Blanchford put it. The first letter, written in 1841, explained at great length that Phillips regarded the Church of England as the true Catholic Church of the nation, even if no longer in communion with the Holy See. He was also disposed to admit the genuineness of Anglican orders, and told Bloxham that, as a priest of this true Catholic Church, he offered the Immaculate Lamb in the Most Holy Eucharist every time he administered the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion, according to the Book of Common Prayer. He went on to tell Bloxham that once the true Catholic Church in this kingdom had regained her liberty and independence from state tyranny and was reunited with the Holy See, he had visions of the service of God according to the Holy Sarum Rite, being celebrated in all cathedrals, collegiate and conventual churches in the Latin tongue. He hoped that Vespers might be sung in English, and those portions of the Mass which the Sarum Rite prescribes to be said in a loud voice might also be celebrated in English, whilst the canon being said in a low voice by the priest alone would continue in Latin. The clergy would give up the recitation of matins and evensong, and adopt the Sarum Breviary in Latin. Where there was a sufficient number to celebrate the canonical hours, they would sing them in Latin using the holy ceremonies and the vestments. The optimistic young convert was certain that the Holy See would give every facility for the restoration of the Catholic unity in England. Thus the present bishops and priests might retain their wives, and even certain relaxations of the ancient canons might be permitted in future for the Anglican clergy, if they desired it before God. Phillips was confident that Gregory XVI would sanction the suppression of the direct invocation of saints in the public liturgy, and understand that there must be restraint in the use of pictures and images so far as England was concerned. He just could not conceive that there need be the slightest difficulty upon this head. Moreover, and this was very important, he was sure that the great body of the aristocracy would follow the movement of the clergy in the Romeward direction. If negotiations could be started at once, the public mind would soon be prepared. It would be easy to convince the young Queen Victoria and the Prince Consort of the propriety of supporting such a glorious measure with the whole force of the state. Should the dissenters, the Orangemen, or the evangelical party in the established church protest, or even proceed to open rebellion, they would be crushed immediately. Last but not least, it was certain that the lower orders would welcome the restoration of the old quadripartite division of church property. These opinions were expressed only 12 years after the passing of the Catholic Relief Act, 1829, and shortly after the storm provoked by the publication of Tract 90. This 32-year-old Leicestershire squire was clearly out of sympathy with the establishment of his day. He was nevertheless active and prominent in an equally real world, which was in touch, as Victorian England generally was not, with the European Christian and Catholic tradition. He had a large family, and he and his wife entertained lavishly at Grace du Menor. The house parties often included Anglican clergymen and laymen of a temper congenial to their host. As the 20th century ecumenical movement has found, hospitality in a strange but friendly setting is a powerful solvent of ecclesiastical differences. The Anglican guests who assisted at the inspiring religious functions carried out in William Railton's Gothic Revival domestic chapel, enlarged and richly furnished by A.W. Pugin in 1848, must sometimes have found it difficult to remember that in the eyes of the Holy See, they themselves were schismatics, if not heretics. Newman was characteristically wary. He was more than once invited to stay at Grace Dieu, but he never went there until after his conversion in 1845, feeling that it was for bishops to take the initiative in reunion, and that anyway Rome lacked the note of sanctity. As far back as 1841, the visionary squire of Grace-Dieu and Garendon, had planned the formation of a Uniate church in England. In a letter to Bloxham, he said, "It is no new thing for Catholics of various rites to dwell together in the same country, each being governed even by bishops in ordinary." It was on September 29, 1850, that Pius IX restored the Catholic hierarchy in England by letters apostolic Universalis Ecclesiae with the Metropolitan See at Westminster, and at first 12 suffragan sees. Phillips rejoiced that the Roman authorities had not named any of the new dioceses after the medieval sees. He felt this was a proof that the Pope shared his opinion that the established church was the true and canonical church of the nation. Now one could say that there were Catholics of both the English and Latin rites, each with its own bishops. Sooner or later, Queen Victoria and the bishops nominated by her would realize it is their right and safe course to unite themselves to a foreign rite, and to the Mother Church of Christendom, and to the immediate pastoral care of Peter. Everything would work out all right in the long run. All that was needed now was a crusade of prayer. In the spring of 1857, Phillips published his Irenic pamphlet on the future unity of Christendom, conveying the impression that before very long both the Eastern churches and the Anglican Communion would be reunited with the Western Patriarchate. In July, he had a meeting in London with Bishop Forbes of Brechin, Mr. F. G. Lee, and George F. Boyle, afterwards Earl of Glasgow. The purpose of this gathering was to discuss how Catholics of the English and Latin rites could unite together in prayer. On September 8, 1857, the Feast of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, an organization known as the Association for the Promotion of the Unity of Christendom, was founded. Its object was defined as united prayer that visible unity may be restored to Christendom. Although there were 4 Roman Catholics among the founders, and it received the blessing of Cardinal Wiseman, many priests, including Manning, regarded it with suspicion, if not alarm. It was Manning who persuaded the Catholic hierarchy in England to take action, with the result that a papal rescript dated September 16, 1864, condemned the association. The English bishops were ordered to take immediate steps to prevent the faithful having any further part in its activities. Phillips, who had adopted the name of Delisle in 1863 as the representative of that ancient family, was not downhearted. Contemplating the Church of England from Grace-Dieu Manor of Garendon Park, his mind soared over the separation between Rome and Canterbury like a skylark over a hedge, as was said of the second Viscount Halifax. He rejoiced at the rapid progress of the Catholic movement and would point to the fact that his prophecy of 1841 had come true. Vernacular versions of the Sarum Missal were being used in a few parish churches, if not yet in any cathedrals. Vestments were being worn, and even incense burned in 2 or 3 places. Even more encouraging, perhaps, was the report of the foundation of a congregation of the Venerable Bede, an esoteric body whose members were said to be working underground for the reunion of Ecclesia Anglicana with both the Western and Eastern Patriarchates. Delisle's visions found expression in the chapter he contributed to Essays on the Reunion of Christendom. Published in 1867, he painted a glowing picture of the Catholic worship now found in more and more Anglican churches, restored in all their ancient grandeur. The sweet perfume of holy incense is again inhaled in our ancient temples. The names of Mary and the saints are again honored and invoked, and men are once more called to the practice of sanctity and the imitation of the saints, and the people are once more summoned to the tribunal of penance, and Catholic morality is again inculcated in pulpits that used to utter only the errors of Calvin or Luther. The second spring had been succeeded by high summer, and the fields were ripe for the harvest. Those pulpits that heretofore resounded with blasphemous denunciations of the real presence and scoffings at transubstantiation now pour forth orthodox and devotional vindications of Christ's presence in the sacrament of the altar, and of the priceless value of that clean oblation, which the prophet Malachi had foretold should everywhere be offered among the converted Gentiles from the rising to the setting of the sun. Any foreign ecclesiastic reading Delisle's flamboyant phraseology might have inferred that Dr. Longley, Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Thompson, Archbishop of York, and the rest of the Church of England hierarchy were accustomed to pontificate at High Mass and Vespers in their respective cathedrals, vested in chasubles or copes, with mitres and croziers. Delisle carefully avoided any reference to the persecution of the so-called Puseyite clergymen, which would have suggested that the minds of the authorities in the Church of England were not quite so Catholic as the worship he described. He was appointed High Sheriff of the County of Leicester in 1868, and chose Dr. F. G. Lee as his chaplain, but Canon D. J. Vaughan, vicar of St. Martin's, Leicester, refused to allow this notorious ritualist to preach the assize sermon before the judges. The Squire of Grace Dieu also took on the spiritual responsibilities of godfather to Lee's second son, Ambrose Delisle, when the child was baptized in the Church of England. Delisle invited some of his Anglo-Catholic friends to stay with him shortly after the publication of the essays, some of which were quite as pro-Roman as his own contribution. Between them they drew up the tentative project for the Uniate Church. Communion under both kinds would be allowed, and even married bishops would be tolerated. On the other hand, it would be better if men already ordained were forbidden to take wives. Lastly, to ensure absolute validity of orders, it would be advisable in the first instance for deacons, priests, and bishops to be reordained sub conditione by prelates of the Latin Rite, with powers delegated for that purpose by the Holy See. The Uniate Church, which was planned at Grace Dieu Manor, for the intentions of which many masses were offered in its magnificent chapel and in the unfinished church at Mount St. Bernard's Abbey, would have a vernacular liturgy based on the Book of Common Prayer. The promoters decided that such additions would only be made as would validate ordination services of bishops, priests, and deacons, and make orthodox and perfect the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. Among those whom Delisle invited to draw up a scheme for this Uniate Church was Dr. John Thomas Secombe, who stayed at Mount St. Bernard's Abbey in his youth, though it is not certain that he was ever in communion with Rome, and later on is said to have joined one of the Eastern churches, just as S. G. Hatherley did in 1856. It was early in 1877 that Secombe wrote to Dr. Lee, saying, "I have been working hard at the scheme, not without result, as I will show you when we meet. There is nothing like having a definite course chalked out, for when the time of action comes, it often happens that mistakes are made by want of consideration. But whatever is done, I hope the establishment may remain for many years, even though we may not share the advantages of it." At least a rough draft of this scheme had been prepared some time before this, for it was early in 1876 that it was disclosed in a pamphlet by Presbyter Anglicanus. It took the form of an open letter addressed to Cardinal Manning. Delisle distributed copies among his friends, and on January 12, 1876, he wrote to Manning, "I hear from various quarters, all more or less good and reliable sources, the actual number of whom Presbyter Anglicanus, as the deputed mouthpiece, variously estimated as from 500 to 1,000 of the clergy, and from 50,000 to 100,000 of the laity. Be this as it may, if the snowball is favored by the Holy See, it will gather round it even millions, all who care for Christianity in our very dear old England. And of one thing I am perfectly certain, that we, with our countless encumbrances and our frightful burden of abuses from one end of the earth to the other, shall never win England or any other nation again, but shall continue to lose every day more and more of the few that remain to us. But behold, the Lord sends us an offer of new life, which may be the germ of moral regeneration for the whole earth, under the fostering care of the Holy See." At this time, Delisle was in one of his most apocalyptic moods. A week later, he addressed another letter to Manning, warning him of the avalanche which he saw sweeping down in the near future over Westminster and the whole of Britain. He wrote, "Will it be a snowball gathering in size as it rolls down, or will it evaporate in a cloud of vapor? This under God rests with you. If you give it a valiant support, the movement will embrace all who are needed, from the prince who is destined to rule us to the peasant who waits upon the landlords of England. At the moment, the Prince of Wales was touring around India, and it is difficult to believe that he would have been much inclined to give his support to a movement which had for its object to bring the established church under the control of the papacy. As to the average village yokel, he had an ingrained fear and hatred of everything associated with popery. Delisle also tried to win the support of Newman, but his reply, dated January 19, 1876, was very critical, even if sympathetic. Feeling perhaps that he had been too hard on Delisle, Newman wrote again on January 27th, saying, "Nothing will rejoice me more than to find that the Holy See considers it safe and promising to sanction some such plans as the pamphlet suggests. I give my best prayers, such as they are, that some measure of drawing to us so many good people who are now shivering at our gates may be discovered." Most Catholics were alarmed by the scheme proposed in the pamphlet, and it was attacked in the tablet. Dr. Littledale denounced it as a dastardly intrigue with Rome, and the majority of high Anglicans were hostile. Abuse was showered on Presbyter Anglicanus, who was suspected of being the vicar of All Saints Lambeth. Dr. Lee defended the pamphlet in several letters printed in the tablet, stating that he had received assurances of sympathy which more than outbalanced the abuse of opponents. He explained that the scheme suggested was in no way a plot against the established Church of England. A correspondent described him in The Guardian as a cheat, a swindler, a traitor, and a fool. On April 19, 1876, Presbyter Anglicanus, the Reverend Edmund Huff, rector of Little Cawthorpe, Links 1853 to 1891, and author of First Principles of the Laws of England, wrote, "It remains to be seen whether any of the Anglican clergy will avail themselves of the opportunity which now seems offered to them of approaching collectively the Holy See and submitting their difficulties to its consideration, thus opposing a united front to the growing forces of irreligion and unbelief. Things could not have been worse so far as the High Church Anglican clergymen were concerned. In February 1876, the Reverend C.J. Ridsdale, vicar of Folkestone, was tried by Lord Penzance at Lambeth Palace for illegal ceremonial, with a verdict for the plaintiffs. In July, the Reverend Arthur Tooth of St. James Hatcham and the Reverend T. Pelham Dale of St. Vedaste's in the city of London were both summoned to appear before the courts. The former was committed to Horsemonger Jail, and the latter confined in Holloway Prison. These cases were only the start of prosecutions for what was maintained to be illegal ceremonial. There was sufficient excuse for Anglo-Catholics to seek any means of gaining their freedom from the trammels of the establishment, no matter what means they employed. To the papalist minority, it was evident that the Gordian knot must be cut, and cut quickly. The amiable Delisle was moving heaven and earth to assist this minority, and he had the support of his domestic chaplain, Father Cesario Tondini di Quarenghi, an Italian Barnabite, who was a priest of large ideas and extremely liberal views. Delisle wrote about him to Gladstone, saying, "He is profiting, I think, by what he observes every day in the development of sound and charitable feeling between the members of our respective communions." Father Henry Collins and other Cistercian monks at Mount St. Bernard's Abbey also encouraged their founder in this scheme for a Uniate church in England. So Delisle went on oiling the wheels at Rome, informing cardinals and monsignori that the persecuted Anglican clergymen deserved every possible sympathy and encouragement, not only for their own sake, but for that of the Catholic world at large. Father Tondini petitioned Pius IX to bless an association of prayers for the return of the separated churches of the East, especially the Greco-Russian Church, to Catholic unity. At the end of the petition, Tondini had inserted the request that papal approval might be exerted, so as to include in its intentions not only the non-Catholics of the East, but also Christians now separated from the center of unity, and more especially the Anglicans and others of these kingdoms. The Pope returned the document with the words "Benedicat et exaudiat vos Deus, and dated May 13, 1877. Delisle immediately informed Gladstone of this glorious news, saying, "The Pope has now committed himself over head and ears to the 2 points for which I have always agitated through good report and evil report. The first is for the principle of corporate reunion. The second is for the special prayers for the reunion of the Greco-Russian Church with our Latin Church." Father J. H. Crean, Society of Jesus, commenting upon the above in an article published in The Month, June 1953, wrote, "What Delisle obtained from Pius IX, then in the last year of his life, will probably never be known. But if one supposed that the Pope had given Delisle some verbal warrant for going ahead with his plans, it would explain something of what followed in the episode of the clandestine consecrations. It hardly needs saying that, to Delisle, corporate reunion meant the creation of a Uniate Church in England, with orders derived in the first instance from Latin prelates. It is unlikely that it will ever be discovered what went on behind the scenes during the winter and spring of 1876 through 1877, because in after years Dr. Lee took care to destroy all evidence. Others involved in the project of a Uniate Church also felt it safer to burn the relevant letters and documents. The Reverend H.R.T. Brandreth, after thorough research, found little new material to give the readers of his Dr. Lee of Lambeth a chapter in parenthesis in the history of the Oxford movement. It is possible, however, considering Father Nuget's previous contacts as secretary of the APUC with Cardinal Patrizzi and his knowledge of the workings of the Roman Curia, that it was he who negotiated with certain important ecclesiastics. Correspondence may have been carried on between the Vatican and St. Austin's Priory and the New Kent Road. Nuget's monkery of rich men, a most unconventional sort of community. It is suggested that Cardinal Mai, whose name was constantly whispered as being concerned in the conspiracy, did persuade the Pope to turn a pontifical blind eye to the proceedings until it should be seen how the venture would fare. This would account for some later curious facts. A more curious fact still is that Cardinal Mai died in 1854. Whether the scheme was being planned in the slums of Lambeth or in the slums of Walworth, preparations went forward. Encouraged by what they regarded as papal approval and urged on by Delisle from his mansion on Charnwood Forest, the promoters of the Uniate Church decided to hold a synod early in July 1877. They informed Delisle, who replied, "I hail the meeting of the first synod of the new ecclesiastical organization as one of the most important steps that has been taken since the era of the Reformation. I shall commend it to the prayers of our chaplain in the celebration of the most holy mysteries in our chapel tomorrow, and most heartily do I pray that God will pour out his blessing upon the synod and guide it by his holy and life-giving spirit, so that it may become a great instrument towards promoting the reunion of Christendom, and thus paving the way for the full development of the kingdom of Jesus Christ over the whole world. The hearts of all good men seem now more and more turned towards Rome and the healing of our deplorable divisions. But we have all sinned, and we must all humble ourselves before God and implore his mercy and assistance. The holy sacrifice will also be celebrated for this intention tomorrow in the Church of St. Bernard's Abbey." The synod duly took place, and on July 7, 1877, the tablet reprinted a notice that had appeared in the Morning Post the previous Thursday, headed "The Order of Corporate Reunion." It said that the first synod of this new organization, regarding which such varied rumors and reports have been current for some months past, was held in London on Tuesday and Wednesday, the 3rd and 4th of this month. The proceedings, which, so we are informed, were conducted with all the order and gravity common to solemn synods, was opened by Mass of the Holy Ghost, according to the Sarum Rite, followed by prayers and intercessions given in Gavantus. The work undertaken by the promoters was carried on and completed in perfect unanimity. We understand that a formal pastoral of the rector and provincials will be issued early in September. Further hints of this development were given by Dr. Lee in a letter printed in the Morning Post on July 14, 1877. He stressed the major evils of the established church as it then existed, and in the final paragraph indicated that he and his colleagues had been devising in shadow of Lambeth Palace, saying, absolutely denouncing all lawlessness, with sacramental basis on which no dark shadow of doubt can henceforth ever fall, and with dogmatic principles accepted by both East and West, we bind ourselves together anew under godly obedience and discipline, for necessary self-defense, for cooperation, and for promoting the grand and most necessary work of corporate reunion, the highest and greatest need of our time. Even the lower animals, when attacked, have the instinct to herd together for self-defense. We shall do no more, but we shall do no less. This letter evoked a sympathetic reply from the Irish poet Aubrey de Vere, 1814 through 1902, whom Lee had taken into his confidence. Like Delisle, he had never lost his affection for the Church of England after he entered the Church of Rome in 1851, as the result of the Gorham Judgment. The rector and provincials of this new organization were now ready for their subversive activities. At the same time that William Booth and the inner circle of the Christian mission in East London were drawing up a rough draft of the organization, which a year later would be given the name of the Salvation Army, they were preparing a preliminary version of a pastoral letter which was dated the Feast of the Assumption, August 15, 1877. Later on, printed copies of this manifesto were sent to the Pope and to all Catholic bishops, which presumably meant those in communion with the Holy See. Copies were also posted to the leading newspapers in Britain, so that the general public should be made aware of this grand and most necessary work of corporate reunion, which had been launched. It started as follows: Pro Deo, pro Ecclesia, pro Patria. In the sacred name of the most holy, undivided, and adorable Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Thomas, by the favor of God, Rector of the Order of Corporate Reunion and Provincial of Canterbury; Joseph, by the favor of God, Provincial of York, in the Kingdom of England; and Lawrence, by the favor of God, Provincial of Cerdion, in the Principality of Wales, with the provosts and members of the Synod of the Order, to the faithful in Jesus Christ, whom these presents may concern, health and benediction in the Lord God everlasting. Every faithful Christian must surely be distressed and bewildered at the spectacle afforded by the evil state into which the National Church of England has been brought by departure from ancient principles and by recent events. A long course of change, usurpation, and revolution has removed all her old landmarks. The evil is continually working, no man being able to foresee whereunto it will grow, or what will be the end thereof. Two things are certain, however. On the one hand, that all semblance of independent existence and corporate action has departed from the established church, so that she is given up, as it were, bound hand and foot, and blindfolded into the toils of her enemies, while on the other hand these enemies are waiting to rob of her privileges and possessions, and are even now debating how to divide the spoil. The very long pastoral continued with a summary of the history of the pre- and post-Reformation Ecclesia Anglicana, now utterly dependent on the state. The writers stressed that the bishops had yielded up all canonical authority and jurisdiction in the spiritual order, since they were merely state officials. The provincials of Canterbury, York, and Cerdion stated that they were engaged in securing 3 distinct and independent lines of new episcopal succession, so as to labor corporately, and on no sandy foundation, for the heading of the breach that has been made. By the favor of God, they intended to make full use of their authority and defy the Anglican bishops who had appealed unto Caesar. Under the patronage and protection of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, the holy apostles Peter and Paul, St. Gregory the Great, and St. Augustine of Canterbury, these 3 prelates bound themselves together with other members of the order to contend against the grave and complicated evils which threatened to overwhelm them. They based their dogmatic position upon the decrees of the Council of Trent and the Synod of Bethlehem. It would take up too much space to give a full summary of the rest of this manifesto, which ended with the following words. As regards the chief aim of this new order, corporate reunion, it is needed to remark finally that while we have to deplore the divisions existing amongst the churches, we cannot unchurch any having a true succession. Therefore we pray for all, we remove all stumbling blocks in the way of union against the baptized, whom we hail and regard as brethren, while on disputed points of church opinion, not yet defined by lawful authority, we appeal to a free general council, with earnest prayers to God for its speedy assembly and guidance by the Holy Ghost. Amen. To appreciate the full flavor of this ambitious pronouncement and to understand how remote it was from reality, it must be considered in relation to contemporary events and the setting in which it was composed. On January 1st, 1877, Queen Victoria had been proclaimed Empress of India with much magnificence at Delhi, Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. Russia was at war against Turkey. Our Boys had not ended its run of 1,350 nights at the Vaudeville Theater, and William Booth was planning in Whitechapel the reorganization of his Christian mission as the Salvation Army for the revival of religion among the very lowest classes. The pro-provincial of Canterbury and the provincials of York and Ceylon drew up the joint pastoral in a vicarage located in York Street, just off Lower Marsh, Lambeth, so called because the ground lay low and was damp and soggy. Lower Marsh, the petticoat lane of South London, was a sort of rag fair filled with costers, stalls, and barrows, lit up by hissing naphtha lamps after dark. No respectable lady wearing the still fashionable bustle and quite unable to run because of the tightness of her skirt dared to walk along Lower Marsh at night. Most of the parishioners of All Saints were hawkers, small tradespeople, day laborers, and mechanics. Few of them ever crossed the threshold of the church. Their poverty was appalling. The back windows of the vicarage looked on to a huddle of mean streets and alleys which had been one of London's most notorious red light districts for about 20 years. There were at least a dozen gin palaces and many more beer shops within a few yards of All Saints. The provincials, provosts, and members of the order, when gathering for their secret deliberations, had to penetrate these labyrinths of crime, lust, and poverty. Within earshot of the vicarage study, the trains rumbled on the long brick viaduct between Waterloo and Vauxhall stations. On a hot summer evening, with the window open, the composition of this pastoral letter must have been disturbed by the cries of verminous, often bandy-kneed and bow-legged children, or the shouts of youths playing pitch and toss on the pavement of York Street, very likely ogling a gin-sodden female in bedraggled finery as she slipped into the shadows of the dark archway beneath the railway, safe from scrutiny by the police. Less than half a mile away was Lambeth Palace, secluded in its walled park, one of the official residences of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The time was not yet ripe, however, for a Jesuit cardinal to lunch there, or for the primate of all England to call on the Pope, or envisage reunion with Rome on any terms. The pastoral was finally read on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral soon after the sunrise on the morning of September 8, 1877, but without reference to the dean and chapter or to the Bishop of London, Dr. Jackson, who was a pious but tolerant evangelical. On September 16th, the tablet devoted a long article to this extraordinary document, which was entitled An Ecclesia in Imperio. It began, "We have been looking out since the spring for a phenomenon about which diverse dark and mysterious hints have been privately dropped from time to time. It has at length burst upon an astonished world. This phenomenon is nothing less than a kind of ritualistic crypto-hierarchy. On Saturday last, being the feast of the Nativity of Our Lady St. Mary, the Blessed Mother of God, in the year of our Lord and of the world's redemption, 1877, was drawn up, approved, ratified, and solemnly promulgated in the divinely protected city of London," a phrase which gives a quite deliciously oriental flavor to the proceeding. a kind of bull, brief, or encyclical to all the faithful whom these presents concern. It may be naturally asked by whom it is issued. We regret that here the information becomes somewhat defective. The surnames which appear on the face of the document are Irons, as the delineator and engraver of the somewhat ambitious decoration prefixed to it, and the original of which is apparently intended to be worn round the neck of somebody, and that of Adrian de Helt, notary apostolic, which testifies that on the 15th of August, this is a true copy of an instrument which we are informed was drawn up on the 8th of September. We regret to be unable to inform our readers who these gentlemen are. We do not for a moment suppose that the first name has anything to do with that of a well-known Anglican clergyman. Of the second we know nothing whatsoever. Now for the object of all this solemn fooling, for without wishing to speak harshly or even unsympathetically, we can call it nothing else. Its authors have opened their eyes to the fact that, as all the authorities of their communion being against them, they are somewhat in the position of rebels. Therefore, by way of mending matters, they have resolved to invent amateur superiors of their own kidney. Nor is it even a pretended religious order which the superiors are to govern. It is rather a church within a church, to which anybody is admitted who can prove that he is baptized, or will submit to conditional baptism, unless he be a presbyter who has been twice married, a divorced person, or a deceased wife's sister, a Freemason, or a member of a similar secret society. This long article in a leading Roman Catholic weekly must have made Delisle extremely indignant, but it showed how the Uniate Church for which he had been praying and working since 1841 was regarded by most of his co-religionists. The comments of the Anglican press were even more abusive. If Delisle were in the secret, he kept to himself the identity of the rector and the provincials of the new order, not even revealing them to De Vere, with whom he exchanged several long letters in the autumn of 1877. With the appearance in the autumn of 1877 of the first number of the Reunion magazine, edited by Dr. Lee, the British public was able to understand that the OCR was utterly disloyal to the Church of England, at least as understood by Queen Victoria and all her bishops, for Laurentius, provincial of Caerleon, wrote that, "It is quite true that we, OCR, do not assume an attitude of independence toward the Holy See. We frankly acknowledge that in the providence of God, the Roman Pontiff is the first bishop of the Church, and therefore its visible head on earth. We do not believe that either the Emperor of Russia or the Queen of England is the head of the Church. As the Church must have some executive head, and as there is no other competitor, we believe the Pope to be that head. But he is more than this, for he is our Patriarch as well, so that we admit his claim to the veneration and loyalty of all baptized men, and in a special degree of all Western Christians, and in these capacities we prayed for him in our constituent synod." After such a pro-papal pronouncement, it was not surprising that many Roman Catholics began to look at the OCR more favorably. Indeed, the Jesuit-edited Civilita Catholica went so far as to publish a letter from its English correspondent in the issue for April 20th, 1878, in which he wrote, "The Order of Corporate Reunion actively pursues its labors, and its officers have sent forth a pastoral letter containing an exposition of its views and end. It is known that several Anglican ministers in connection with the society have induced a Greek bishop, whose name, however, it has not as yet been possible to ascertain, to ordain them under certain conditions, in order that the doubt to which Anglican orders are subject may not be alleged as a reason for taking exception to the validity of their operations. The three leading officers of the order have received episcopal consecration from the same quarter, a quarter which, according to what is said, is of such a character as to completely exclude any question as to the validity of the order so conferred. When once the time shall come for submitting the matter for examination by the Holy See, so soon as a sufficient number of the Anglican clergy shall have in this way removed the difficulty which arises from their ordination, the order hopes to be able to present its petition for corporate reunion with the Catholic Church, signed by a number of members so imposing as to render it impossible for the Holy See not to recognize the gravity and importance of the movement. Had Delisle survived this letter, he would have felt that he could almost chant his Nunc Dimittis, and that his lifelong vision of the reunion of the Anglican and Roman churches was very nearly a fait accompli. But on March 5th, 3 weeks before this issue of the Civita Cattolica was published in Rome, he died a holy death at Garendon Park. Very different from the line taken by the Roman Jesuits was that of the anti-papal section of the Anglo-Catholic Party. They regarded the order as utterly beyond contempt, as a new nonconformist sect set up to defy the true Catholic Church of England. But there was nothing they could do, except to shower abuse, because so far nobody had managed to discover the identity of the mysterious Thomas, Joseph, and Lawrence, the rector and 2 provincials of the order. The secret was well kept. It was not until December 18, 1878, that the Church Review, thanks to the investigations of the Reverend W. Allen Whitworth, then vicar of St. John the Evangelist, Hammersmith, and later vicar of All Saints, Margaret Street, disclosed that it was fairly clear, but not absolutely certain, that Thomas's was the notorious Reverend F. G. Lee, vicar of All Saints, Lambeth, and that he and his 2 colleagues, whoever they were, had been consecrated secretly by Roman, Greek, and Armenian bishops. Mr. Whitworth's letter was answered in a pamphlet entitled, "Is the Order of Corporate Reunion Schismatical?" The author was a Mr. William Grant, who claimed to be the registrar of the order. He corrected certain statements, but did not deny the charge that Dr. Lee and his 2 associates had been consecrated in an irregular manner. The mystery remained, and it was not until the spring of 1879 that a writer in the Whitehall Review said that he was certain that the rector provincial was Dr. Lee, and the provincial of York the Reverend T. W. Mossman. But he concluded wrongly that Bishop Lawrence of Caerleon must be the Reverend Joseph Leicester Lynn, otherwise Father Ignatius of Lanthony. Eventually it was discovered that the 3rd prelate is believed to have been the Norfolk physician and magistrate John T. Secombe. See pages 42 and 63. The reason for selecting these titles is not clear. A diocese of Dorchester in Oxfordshire had been set up in 635 by St. Oswald, king of Northumberland, and Singelis, king of the West Saxons, with St. Birinus as its first bishop. The see existed until about 1086, when it was transferred to Lincoln. Selby Abbey, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, founded by William the Conqueror about 1069, was never the seat of a bishopric in pre-Reformation times. The choice of Caerleon in Monmouthshire as the 3rd see suggests that the Order of Corporate Reunion did not recognize the Reverend R.W. Morgan as first patriarch of a revived ancient British church, for he is said to have assumed this title in 1874. Hartwell de la Garde Grissel, the accomplished papal chamberlain who collected books, bindings, birds' eggs, brass rubbings, coins, relics, and much else, recorded in after years that Bishop Lee, who was staying with him in Oxford at the time, enthroned himself in Dorchester Abbey. They made the 9 miles pilgrimage on foot very early one morning, and Grissel witnessed the enthronement. There is no evidence, however, that Bishop Mossman ever did the same at Selby Abbey. The late Prebendary H.F.S. Mackay, vicar of All Saints, Margaret Street, used to tell a story that when as a boy he was staying at St. David's, one morning he found 3 strange clergymen in the choir of the cathedral. 2 of them were conducting a sort of service over the 3rd, who was sitting in the bishop's throne. He inclined to think in after years that he had assisted at the enthronement of Dr. Secombe as Bishop of Caerleon. The mystery of the consecrations of Lee and Mossman has never been solved. All that is fairly certain is that during the summer of 1877 they made a brief trip to Italy, apparently accompanied by Secombe, and stayed at Venice. This is how the Reverend H.R.T. Brandreth sums up the various legends in his Dr. Lee of Lambeth. Near that place, Venice, probably at Murano, Lee, Mossman, and Secombe were conditionally rebaptized and confirmed, made deacon, ordained priest, and consecrated bishop by a mysterious triumvirate of prelates, the identity of whom has never been divulged, but who were popularly supposed to have been a Greek, a Copt, and either a Roman or an Old Catholic. All evidence was destroyed during Lee's lifetime, and thus we are left to build our theories on circumstantial evidence. It is just possible that the generally accepted story is true, and certainly the OCR bishops allowed it to circulate, and no other version of the episode was accepted by or current among responsible people during Lee's lifetime. Certain facts are beyond dispute, namely that a consecration did take place in summer of 1877, that it took place in Italy, that the bishops consecrated were Lee and Mossman, that the consecrating prelates had orders accepted as valid at Rome. It is probable that the prelates were in communion with Rome. The remainder of the story is open to question. Sicom was almost certainly a bishop before 1877, though he was probably given conditional reconsecration by Lee and Mossman on their return from Italy. A picturesque addition to the story is that it took place on the high seas, but that too is probably not true. The whole business was so shrouded in secrecy that it is probably impossible today to arrive with any certainty at the facts of the case. Then there is another legend that the prime mover in these clandestine consecrations was Monsignor de Calabania, Archbishop of Milan, and that at least one of them was performed by one of his suffragan bishops, according to the Ambrosian Rite. But there are yet more stories, and one of them told by the late Dr. George G. Williamson, literature doctorate, who had been a member of the OCR in his youth, that one of the consecrations took place in Umbria, and the other at or near Venice, probably by some prelate connected with the Armenian Uniat monastery on the island of San Lazzaro. The name of the Bishop of Murano was also mentioned in connection with the affair, but although Murano, an island in the Venetian lagoons, still has its ancient cathedral, many centuries have passed since it had a bishop, so this suggestion can be dismissed. Father Crayon, Society of Jesus, inclined to think that the consecrations did actually take place on the high seas, or at any rate on tidal waters outside the territorial limits of a diocese, presuming that these are 3 miles offshore like normal fishing limits, and pointed out, if the Pope had given Delisle a general sanction to go ahead with his scheme, it is quite possible that he did not contemplate the actual steps which Lee and Mossman then took, and that he had not armed them with the canonical dispensations that would have saved them the embarrassment of a day at sea voyaging from Chioggia on the Venetian lagoon, or rolling gently in the pass of Malamocco. After Dr. Lee had published an article entitled The Order of Corporate Reunion in the 19th Century, November 1881, he was attacked again by both Anglicans and Roman Catholics, though some of the latter defended him. A writer in the tablet, December 8, 1881, summed up what most people now felt about the whole business, that it was an ignis fatuus that has already lured on too many souls who had reached the threshold of the fold, but who remained to die outside. How sad to have to say of such amiable men that their last state is likely to prove worse than the first. The English Church Union, a society formed in 1859 to defend and further the spread of high church principles among Anglicans, formally expelled Dr. Lee from its ranks. The Society of the Holy Cross, composed of Anglo-Catholic priests, removed the name of Bishop Mossman from the roll of brethren, issuing a report warning Catholics not to be associated with the OCR, lest they should be involved in the guilt of schism and probably of sacrilege. Taken all round, the OCR proved to be little more than a damp squib that did not explode. So few people joined the order after 1879 that a certain Mr. Umfneville, who had not been appointed its official badge maker, found a large number of badges left on his hands. To recover the cost, he brought an action against Lee. Judgment was given in his favor, but on Lee's appeal it was reversed. Although Freemasons and members of other similar secret societies could not be enrolled in the OCR, nothing could have been more surreptitious than the manner in which its affairs were conducted. All those who were deemed worthy for initiation had to swear that they would never divulge anything about it, or even reveal the names of other members. Like the seal of the confessional, this obligation covered direct and indirect revelation. For example, unguarded statements from which matters heard in the confessional could be deduced or recognized. How seriously the OCR members regarded their oaths is proved by the fact that none of those who survived the disappearance of the order in the 1890s appear to have made public its secrets, not even those who eventually submitted to the Roman Church. Only 4 numbers to the Reunion magazine appeared, and it ceased publication in 1879. How many persons were given conditional baptism is not known. Neither has it been recorded what were the number of confirmations imparted by the one or other of the 3 original bishops. The estimated figures of men ordained or given conditional reordination vary from 50 to 800. Not all those who were given the tonsure and minor orders reached the priesthood. Some appear to have got no further than the subdiaconate. There they were left high and dry, probably to their stupefaction and bewilderment. It is said that in certain cases, laymen who had received the priesthood from OCR bishops were recommended to go through the formality of Anglican ordination in the Scottish Episcopal Church. Since All Saints, Lambeth was repudiated by the Anglo-Catholic organizations. Most of the advanced clergy would discourage their flocks from attending services there, and in the confessional they would doubtless treat this act as an act of schism. Nevertheless, there were some who could not resist the temptation. They would be rewarded by the sight of the vicar in the purple-edged cassock, purple zachetto, black chimere, and episcopal rocher, which made up his costume at matins and evensong. On greater festivals he might even be found wearing a mitre, a late 10th century episcopal headgear which most bishops of the established church still kept for their spoons and carriages, and which was not resumed by a bishop of London until Mandel Crichton's appointment in 1897. Apart from an increasingly scanty attendance of parishioners, the bulk of the congregations was probably made up of the members of such subterranean organizations as the Order of the Holy Redeemer. This order was remarkably similar to the Order of Corporate Reunion. It was started about 1890, and it made All Saints the center of its activities, which indicates that it was sponsored by Bishop Lee. In a letter written by a certain Brother John, dated in 1890, his correspondent is asked, "Shall I have the pleasure of seeing you at All Saints, Lambeth, on Wednesday night, or shall I send you tickets? I can get you a seat in the choir or in the Lady Chapel with the order." This order had an inner circle called the Brotherhood of the Holy Cross, BHC, made up of young men studying for holy orders. In 1891, the Secretary General of the Brotherhood wrote in his monthly letter that postulants must make and sign a declaration of faith. Its 3rd clause consisted of the words, "The position of the Bishop of Rome is that of Archbishop of all the churches, i.e. Chief Bishop, and consequently pastor and teacher of the Church." The Barnet Times, May 8, 1892, printed a letter signed James O.H.R., in which he stated that he believed that no man is justified in staying within the Church of England, save when he feels the vocation of God to assist in restoring her to her lost place, in humble, implicit, and unquestioning submission to the See of Peter, and to the authority of our Holy Father the Pope, which is the object of the Order of the Holy Redeemer. In the following year, it was announced that the order had branches both at home and overseas. The manual indicated that the inner circle was bound by rules of secrecy quite as rigid as those imposed by the OCR. It appears that most of the ordinations and other ceremonies were carried out behind locked doors, either in the private oratory of All Saints Vicarage or until 1892 in the more spacious and stately setting of the Italian Baroque chapel of St. Austin's Priory, Walworth, situated between the Elephant and Castle and the Bricklayer's Arms. It is said that a vernacular version of the Sarum Pontifical was used, and that Mass was celebrated according to the same rite. The young men who were ordained in this clandestine manner had the satisfaction of reflecting that their orders were unquestionably valid. It is true that they were irregular, but jurisdiction was not a matter with which they were much concerned. As to the laying on of hands by Dr. Thorold, they had taken over South London in 1877 as part of the Diocese of Rochester, or by any other bishops of the established church. The OCR prelates regarded this as little or nothing but a civil ceremony required to obtain a benefice rather than valid ordination by one of themselves. In 1889, or perhaps earlier, the Bishop of Dorchester reordained sub conditione the Reverend David Lloyd Thomas, rector of Grainsby, near Grimsby, and local secretary of the APUC for the Diocese of Lincoln. In July 1st of that year, this clergyman preached at All Saints a special sermon on corporate reunion to celebrate the 12th anniversary of the foundation of the OCR. He was received into the Roman Church early in 1897. On March 27th that same year, the tablet printed a statement that Leo XIII had decided that he need only be reordained conditionally. The Bishop of Dorchester, recalled in his later years as an old Oxford don planted in a London slum, somewhat crusty but by no means rusty, very learned, very antique in his ideas, even in his choice of words, lingered on in Lambeth forgotten by most of his surviving contemporaries. He was a militant Tory who venerated Disraeli and hated Gladstone. He believed strongly in class distinctions and was quite sure that God had not made all men equal. Moreover, he was also an ardent Jacobite and a legitimist. A visitor who called at the vicarage towards the close of the 90s related, "As I sat and listened, I felt myself gliding back 2 or 3 centuries. The quaint phrases introduced into his conversation from Elizabethan times, the references to the Bishop of Rome as the undisputed head of Christendom, even the environment of the man, the old-fashioned furniture, made the outside din and tumult seem far away. I forgot that hansom cabs were skimming along the wood-paved streets, that the hokey-pokey man was at the street corner surrounded by a group of board school children, that the various editions of the halfpenny dailies were succeeding one another with strange rapidity, to the yells of the newsboys, extra special, all the winners, horrible double murder and suicide, etc. The doctor transferred me to other times. Leading what was virtually the life of a hermit, buried in his books, the pro-provincial of Canterbury went on dreaming as he had always done. There is evidence that in 1892 he was still prepared to validate orders or to confer them on young men before they underwent what they regarded as the legal formality of the laying on of hands by an Anglican bishop. It had made no difference to the Bishop of Dorchester that there had been 4 archbishops of Canterbury at Lambeth Palace, since he was presented with the living of All Saints in 1867. Dr. Longley, Dr. Tate, Dr. Benson, and Dr. Temple, for all left him in peace. Many more fruitive functions must have taken place in the vicarage oratory, or maybe even in the spacious galleried neo-Norman pro-cathedral off Lower Marsh between 1877 and 1899, when the church was demolished by the Southwestern Railway Company, which had acquired the property for extensions to Waterloo Station. The aged vicar was then forced into an unwilling and unwanted retirement. Shortly before his death on December 23, 1902, Bishop Lee was at long last received into full communion with the Holy See by Father Kenelm Digby Best, a priest of the London Oratory. His body was taken to St. George's Cathedral, Southwark, for a solemn requiem mass. He was buried beside his wife at Brookwood Cemetery, Woking, Surrey. Like the Bishop of Dorchester, the Bishop of Selby was left undisturbed in his parish. But he did not neglect to use the episcopal powers imparted to him by an unknown prelate in Italy. On November 12, 1881, he raised to the priesthood John Elphinstone Robertson, having previously given him minor orders, the subdiaconate and diaconate. Presumably the ceremonies took place at West Torrington, Lincolnshire, a small hamlet at the back of beyond where secrecy would hardly have been necessary. This cleric managed to officiate in several Anglican parishes until the vicar of Parkstone, Dorset, discovered the irregular source of his orders and exposed him in the Church Times. The English Church Union thereupon demanded that Dr. Christopher Wordsworth, Bishop of Lincoln, should inhibit this bogus group, for so they regarded him. But this fatherly prelate merely issued a warning and took no further action. However, a year or two later, Bishop Mossman ordained Hugh Percy Armel, alias Green, in the parish church of West Torrington, which still retains its Tractarian atmosphere. This ceremony did arouse Dr. Wordsworth to action, but having given charitable consideration to the age, learning, and moral character of Dr. Mossman, and his long connection with the Diocese of Lincoln, has come to the conclusion that he may, without impropriety or injury to the Church, refrain under the circumstances from passing upon his offense, grave though it may be, any more severe sentence than that of admonition, has pronounced such sentence accordingly, and warning him to abstain from any repetition of it, under pain of the law and contempt thereof. The Bishop of Selby, now aged 57, wrote to Cardinal Manning on December 14, 1883, "I am walking on a path which is as sharp as a razor's edge, but I also feel that so far I am upheld by the prayers of our Immaculate Mother. I know not how to express my gratitude to the Holy Father for sending me his special blessing." Rather later, Mossman wrote again to Manning, saying, "I must in my character of a Catholic bishop, by which I mean as possessing true episcopal orders, make to you as head of the Catholic Church in this land an unrestricted and unconditional submission as to the exercise of the episcopal office for the time to come. The extent of what I have done in the way of orders you know. With regard to the sacrament of confirmation, it has been my chief pleasure. If you tell me to discontinue this, I will, of course, do so." Before long, he became too frail even to administer confirmation using the oil of chrism, blessed by himself in secret. Hearing that he was not likely to live much longer, the cardinal hurried to Lincoln, drove to West Torrington, received him into the Roman Church, and gave him the last sacraments. Dr. Mossman died on July 6, 1885, and was buried in the churchyard of this hamlet, where his tombstone is near the south porch. Very little has been recorded about the ecclesiastical activities of Dr. Sicom, reputed Bishop of Caerleon. Unlike the other two prelates of the OCR, he never made his peace with the Holy See. From 1875 he had been one of the church wardens in his Norfolk parish, and he seems speedily to have subsided into ordinary Anglicanism. He was buried with Anglican rites after his death in 1895, when his second wife, to whom he was married in 1873, discovered to her surprise that he was a bishop. Within 2 years of Bishop Lee's death, a prelate calling himself Mar Stevens Ruby was said to be running the OCR in a hole-and-corner manner. On February 19, 1905, the archbishops and bishops of an apparently new organization known as the Society for the Restoration of Apostolic Unity issued their first and, so far as is known, their only pastoral letter. The identity of the three prelates who signed their names as Virgilius, Archbishop of Whitby, Cuthbert, Bishop of Lindisfarne, and Thomas, Bishop of Dorchester, has never been revealed, but it is possible, however, that Cuthbert was William Whitebrook, and Thomas certainly Henry B. Ventham. There was at least one man who survived Bishop Lee, and who claimed to be a true OCR bishop. This was J.C. Whitebrook, whose brother William Whitebrook was consecrated by Bishop Miraglia Gulati of the Vilat succession on December 27, 1908, and who may have received a previous consecration. Arnold Harris Matthew, of whom more later, shortly after his consecration at Utrecht in 1908 as Legionary Old Catholic Bishop for England, stated that he had revived the Order of Corporate Reunion. This was not strictly correct, because his organization had not direct continuity with the original OCR. The prime mover in this later scheme was Francis Herbert Bacon, an Anglican whom Matthew had raised to the episcopate on January 7, 1911, as titular Bishop of Durham. The issue for June 19, 1912 of The Torch, one of Matthew's several short-lived periodicals, featured a whole-page advertisement for the revived Order of Corporate Reunion, of which Archbishop Matthew was the honorary prelate, and contained the following intimation: Since the extinction of the OCR by the death of its three bishops, the Right Reverend Frederick George Lee of All Saints Lambeth, the Right Reverend Thomas W. Mossman of Torrington, and the Right Reverend Dr. Sicom, who were all of them consecrated to the episcopate by the most eminent Lord Cardinal Archbishop of Milan in his domestic chapel, no definite step has been taken in the direction of corporate reunion with the Holy See. The letter of Sacerdos Hibernicus in the Torch Monthly Review of May 15th created a profound interest and brought together a body of persons who decided to revive the OCR. Facing the facts that the Roman Church has repeatedly denied the validity of Anglican orders, and that the ordinations of the Church of England are not recognized by any church claiming to be Catholic, the promoters of the revived order felt that all doubt must be set at rest so far as the orders of its clerical members were concerned, and they appealed to Archbishop Matthew of the Old Roman Catholic Church, asking if he would accept the position of honorary prelate of the order, and in that capacity give conditional ordination to such members as had received Anglican ordination. His Grace has replied expressing his willingness, and to conditionally ordain such members as are clergy of the established Church, and who, having received conditional baptism and the sacrament of confirmation, sign a profession of the Catholic faith. The Archbishop stipulated that it must be made perfectly clear to all concerned that his services in connection with this delicate and important matter will be given on the express condition that no fee or reward of any description shall be offered to or will be accepted by him. The order has now started on its way and seeks to enroll members. Mere ritualists are not invited, but earnest-minded Catholics who sincerely desire to help forward the work of corporate reunion with the Holy See will be cordially welcomed. The titular Bishop of Durham was kept quite busy, giving conditional baptism, confirmation, and reordination to Anglican clergymen, usually in his domestic oratory at 33 Esmond Road, Bedford Park, Chiswick. Their names have never been revealed because the revived OCR was as clandestine in its proceedings as was the original order. When Archbishop Matthew published in 1914 the Catholic Church of England, its constitution, faith, episcopal succession, etc., he inserted several regulations to be observed by clerical members of the OCR. For instance, the conditionally reordained priest had to celebrate Mass daily and to use the Missa Romanum, either in Latin or in the vernacular, in place of the mutilated rites sacrilegiously introduced by Cranmer and the Tudor reformers of the Anglican Church. Where the Missal cannot be used in public masses, the defects in the communion rite of the Book of Common Prayer must be made good by the use of approved liturgical books. Among those represented was the Anglican Missal, published by the Society of Saints Peter and Paul, founded in 1911. It is not known how many rectors, vicars, and curates of the established church, having become members of the OCR, were reorganized sub conditione by either Archbishop Matthew or by Bishop Bacon, but it has been estimated at between 200 and 300, though 100 would be nearer the mark. Sometimes the secret was revealed to the elect, and it was an immense satisfaction to know that one was receiving valid absolution from such priests, and assisting at valid masses said by them, so that there was no need to go over to Rome. It is possible that an elderly bachelor named Richard C. Jackson succeeded Bacon as head of the order, even before the latter was reconciled with the Church of England. Some letters dated July 1919 have come to light which are signed Richard, Archbishop of the OCR. He is one of the most intriguing figures in the ecclesiastical underworld of the past 100 years. Born in 1851, he claimed descent from John of Norfolk, the younger brother and heir apparent of Roger, Earl of Norfolk, in the reign of Edward I. It is related that at the age of 12 he could recite by heart the whole of the Psalter and much of Dante's Inferno. Among his tutors as a boy was Dr. J. M. Neal. At Oxford he was introduced to Walter Pater in the spring of 1877. So impressed was the latter by this undergraduate's knowledge of poetry, painting, sculpture, music, and much else that he decided to write a book about him. Such was the origin of Marius the Epicurean, first published in 1885. This typical young aesthete of the early Oscar Wilde era had been in close touch with the Order of Corporate Reunion from its foundation in 1877 and was one of its original members. In 1875, he collaborated with Father Nouget in preparing a breviary for the use of the Order of St. Augustine. After he came down from Oxford, he joined this community in the slums of Walworth, best described as a residential club for religious eccentrics, and which was a hotbed of so-called Romanism. Jackson adopted the monastic name of Brother A. Becket. After Father Nouget's death in 1892 and the dispersal of his canons irregular, Brother A. Becket retired to Thetford Manor, a large semi-detached house in Camberwell. His wealth, tastes, and temperament were indicated by 3 saloons, as he called them: the Gold Room, the White King's Drawing Room, and the Salon de Dante, all overcrowded with reputedly valuable paintings, sculptures, rare books, objects d'art, and miscellaneous bibelots in the manner of the time. The bachelor establishment included a richly furnished private oratory. By whom, when, and where Jackson was ordained priest and consecrated bishop is not known. It is possible that he was raised to the episcopate by the gentleman who called himself Apostolic Vicar of the Independent Church of Southern Switzerland and Bishop of Santa Croce in Sicily, otherwise Edward Ruffin Benedict Donkin, who also claimed for himself the rank of Count. Alternately, the consecrator may have been either William or J.C. Whitebrook. Between 1918 and 1920, Jackson, then nearly 70, attended High Mass at the Anglican Church of St. John the Divine, Kennington, on the greater festivals. He was a gaunt and elderly figure, clad in frock coat and shabby top hat. He displayed a purple stock, a very large pectoral cross, and a jeweled ring. Rather less prelatical was the drooping gray mustache, retained perhaps in memory of Walter Potter. As the sacred ministers, the choirmen and boys passed up the center aisle of George E. Street's Gothic Revival Church, the archbishop always turned to the priest, deacon, and subdeacon, and with arms slightly raised imparted his blessing. He spoke to nobody, and after the service returned to Thetford Manor, where it was said he lived an eremitical existence. Richard C. Jackson was eminently fitted to carry on the torch lit by Dr. F. G. Lee and Ambrose Phillips Delisle. The latter would have found this second-generation Archbishop of the Order of Corporate Reunion a kindred spirit in more ways than one. Jackson died in 1937, aged 86. Soon after the death of Archbishop Matthew in 1919, some of the Anglican priests whom he had conditionally reordained and raised to the episcopate managed to get hold of his register and carefully erase their names from its pages. At the same time, they went on trying to propagate the revived OCR with great zeal. One of these prelates, probably Bishop Bacon, who acted as coadjutor to Monsignor Williams of the Old Roman Catholic Church from January 17th to October 1st, 1920, wrote to a certain father in a letter dated January 22nd, 1920, who had already arranged for a conditional reordination, and said, "Why will you not receive the episcopate at the same time?" The names of 4 bishops were mentioned in the letter, with a hint that order could find room for yet another. This same prelate wrote to the same correspondent a fortnight later. The Archbishop of Canterbury and bishops know nothing about the OCR, but are always trying to find out. But now that poor old AHM, Matthew, is no more, they will find out still less. I would strongly advise W not to receive the priesthood with any idea that it will help him in the Ecclesia Anglicana, for it will not. It will make him an undoubted priest, and this should be worth much, and all, but it would be better for him to seek ordination in the Anglican Church as a simple candidate, not mentioning the OCR, and look upon the ceremony as a ratification of his baptismal vows, or something of that sort. During the early 1920s, with their succession of Anglo-Catholic congresses and priests' convention, the craze for Baroque and Rococo furnishings and decorations in churches went hand in hand with the urge among the more extreme clergy to get their orders put right, especially those who were praying and working for reunion with Rome. They wanted to ensure that the masses they celebrated were valid, and a handful had no scruples about going through a conditional reordination, which they understood would cost them nothing. One letter of this period mentions Father Kilburn of St. Saviour's Hoxton as a likely candidate, for he was already saying Mass in Latin. Of another Anglo-Catholic incumbent, it was said, "He wants to throw in his lot with us. He has money and is apparently prepared to plank down some at once in order to get the OCR going. I think things are working up." Another letter makes it fairly certain that Noel Lambert, vicar of St. Gabriel, South Bromley, from 1916 to 1935, was an OCR bishop. It is possible that Alan Hay, vicar of South Mimms near Barnet, from 1898 until his death, was raised to the episcopate by Archbishop Matthew. But there were other Anglican priests who took good care that their secret reordinations or consecrations were kept dark. In one letter written by an Anglican cleric in the 1920s, he refers to the Church of England as Old Mother Damnable, which had long become a classic phrase, not to say a cliché. This correspondence, and also the memories of persons who were associated with what might be called the Black to Baroque movement, fostered by the Society of Saints Peter and Paul, suggests that the more lawless papalist clergymen only regarded the established church as a source of secure income and were ready to work for it merely for the sake of the assured position it would give them. Their superstitious belief in the magic of apostolic succession was very little different from that held by the members of the Theosophical Society, who at the same time were being raised to the priesthood or episcopate in the liberal Catholic Church. Guiding them from the letters preserved, this clandestine, cloak-and-dagger way of obtaining guaranteed, valid orders by what were called bedroom ordinations went on for several years, but the OCR bishops and clergy were never united among themselves, and it would be uncharitable to quote some of the remarks they made about each other, even if most of them are now dead. Thus Bernard Mary Williams, who in 1919 succeeded Matthew as Metropolitan of the Western Uniate Church, otherwise the Old Roman Catholic Church pro-Uniate Rite, was dismissed by one of the OCR prelates as useless, erratic, and self-willed. This is not surprising, because he had written in his first pastoral, 1920, "I believe it to be fairly well known that I have never been in sympathy with the order, and that I have never ordained one of its members. I propose to refuse holy orders on the lines of the Order of Corporate Reunion, while recognizing that I have a duty to those ordained by my predecessor. There is evidence that the order may still be alive, to judge from a printed leaflet issued by the Most Reverend Adrianus, OCR, which appeared in 1958. This elusive prelate, having given a brief history of the corporate reunion movement, went on to say, after the death of Bishop Jackson, the order became disorganized, although the original line of apostolic succession was maintained. By 1957, there were only 2 members of the executive chapter alive, but they were inactive. They were deeply concerned with the future of the order, and in April 1957, the present writer was approached and asked to undertake the revival of the order. He accepted the task of perpetuating the testimony of the OCR in the modern world, and immediately formed an interim executive chapter. The original objects of the OCR remain as heretofore. Only bona fide members of the established Church of England are admitted as members, and all postulants are required to sign a declaration of faith. All clergy and laity who feel interested in the order are invited to communicate with the address below. All correspondence is treated in strict confidence. So it would be that at this very moment there are cryptic prelates at large in Britain seeking out Anglican clergymen for conditional reordination or tempting them with an offer of the episcopate. Little did young Ambrose March Phillips suspect in 1841 that the Uniate Church he had already begun to dream of would evolve after 120 years into this sort of business. Chapter 4. Joseph René Villot, Mar Timotheos, Old Catholic Archbishop of North America and first primate of the American Catholic Church. Joseph René Villot, like Julius Ferret and Joseph J. Overbeck, was a lapsed Catholic of the Latin Rite. As the direct or indirect progenitor of more than 20 schismatic churches, whose history is recorded in Chapter 8, his adventures in the ecclesiastical underworld are worth relating in some detail. He was born in Paris, the son of a butcher, on January 24, 1854. His parents belonged to the region of La Maine in northwest France and adhered to the moribund Petite Église. His mother died soon after his birth, and Joseph's boyhood and early youth were spent in an orphanage at Paris under the charge of the Brothers of the Christian Schools. The Sons of St. John the Baptist de la Salle saw to it that he was rebaptized conditionally, and that he was confirmed at Notre-Dame Cathedral, Paris, in 1867. During the latter part of the Franco-Prussian War, he enlisted in the Garde Nationale. After the siege of Paris and the horrors of the Commune, he decided to leave France for Canada, having been attracted by the appeals for settlers in rural districts. Soon after landing on Canadian soil, Villot found that a teacher was needed for a school near Ottawa at some distance from the nearest Catholic church. He acted as catechist, and on Sundays, when there was no chance of getting to Mass, conducted services. A certain priest seems to have been impressed by this pious young Frenchman and taught him Latin. After 2 years, having received his calling up papers for military service, Villot returned to France. On arriving at Paris, he was told that 7 years in the army would be required. To quote his own words, "The spirit of liberty which I had imbibed in America, together with the memories of the horrors of the Franco-Prussian War, made me determined to leave my native land rather than re-enter the army. I went therefore to Belgium, and after a few months entered the community of the Christian Brothers, a lay teaching order at Namur. Whether as a conscientious objector or a simple deserter, he was in danger of arrest and imprisonment, just as the future Cure d'Ars, St. John Baptist Vianney, had been about 60 years before this, when he evaded military service. Villot did not find his vocation with this religious institute, but left Belgium in 1876, feeling that he was called to the secular priesthood, and sailed for Canada. His next step was to offer his services to Monseigneur Faber, Bishop of Montreal, who sent him to the College of St. Laurent, conducted by the Holy Cross Fathers, where he studied for 3 years. Villot relates that the teaching of the seminary was so rabidly Romanist that all other beliefs were condemned as heresies, which brought eternal damnation to all that accepted them. During my second vacation, I learned that a famous French priest, Father Chiniquet, who was devoting his life to preaching against Roman error, announced in Montreal a series of sermons. I attended with great fear several of them, and returned to the seminary with my mind much disturbed. What happened next is not quite clear, for Villot's memories vary in certain details from those of other people, who in after years did their best to blacken his character. According to his own story, he left the seminary and sought the advice of a French Protestant pastor in Montreal, a professor at McGill University, founded in 1821, who helped him to continue his studies there for 2 years. On the other hand, McGill has no record of Villot as a student. During this period, he was much troubled by religious doubts. He relates that he saw plainly that while on one hand Romanism had added much error and corruption to the primitive faith, Protestantism had not only taken away Roman errors, but also a part of the primitive deposit of faith. In an effort to obtain peace of mind about 1882, he abandoned his studies at McGill University, and having been reconciled with the Roman Church, retired to the house of the clerics of St. Viator at Bourbonnais, Illinois. After about 6 months, still in a very unsettled state, he met Pastor Chiniquet again and discussed his spiritual problems with this apostate priest. The advice given was that Villot should not return to Bourbonnais, but should go to Green Bay, Wisconsin, where there awaited him a wonderful field of apostolate among the Belgian settlers, who, so it appeared, were ripe for conversion to Protestantism, for they were drifting from Romanism into Spiritism and infidelity. Chiniquy also advised Villatte to write to Hyacinth Loyson, 1827 to 1912, who had been a discalced Carmelite friar and a famous preacher until he was excommunicated in 1869. After he married an American widow 3 years later, he formed a sect known as the Gallican Catholic Church. So it was in March 1884, with the blessing of the two unfrocked priests of the Latin Rite, that Villatte, still a layman, went northwards from Illinois to Wisconsin. He regarded himself as a freelance Presbyterian missionary. The city of Green Bay, incorporated in 1854, had developed from a fur trading settlement started in 1745, and it was the oldest French-Canadian settlement in Wisconsin. Villatte's flocks had their widely scattered homes on the peninsula between Lake Michigan and the 120-mile-long inlet of Green Bay, the city of which name lies at the southern end of the inlet. The first group of Belgians had arrived in this district in 1853. So numerous were Catholics in the northern part of Wisconsin by 1868 that a new diocese of Green Bay was formed from the territory of the Diocese of Milwaukee. By the time that Villatte arrived on the scene, many Belgians had ceased to practice their religion, some having become spiritualists. At Duval, 40 families of lapsed Catholics had opened a schismatic place of worship. Villatte hoped to turn these people into Presbyterians. Before long, so he expected, Monsignor Krautbauer, who had been appointed second bishop of Green Bay in 1873, would find his flock reduced yet more in numbers. This prelate died on December 17, 1885, and was succeeded by Monsignor Katzer, with whom Villatte was later to have dealings. Throughout his long life, Villatte was always interested more in ecclesiastical politics than in the dogmatic or spiritual aspects of religion. He never had the slightest scruples about changing his allegiance from one denomination according to the circumstances in which he found himself at the moment. The basic trouble was that he had no private income on which to fall back. Beggars can't be choosers, and this son of a French butcher was a hard-headed realist when it came to money, never a dreamer of dreams or a romantic visionary like Julius Ferret. He was always an opportunist, but never to any purpose. Unfortunately, none of the horses he backed proved winners. After about a year trying to convert the Belgians on the peninsula north of the city of Green Bay, he saw that it was not going to profit him to remain a Presbyterian missionary. On the advice of Hyacinth Loyson, with whom he had kept in touch, he approached Dr. John Henry Hobart Brown, Episcopalian Bishop of Fond du Lac. The lay missionary pointed out to the bishop that in the northeast part of his diocese there were many hundreds of Belgian and French settlers who had already lapsed from communion with Rome, and that the rest were dissatisfied with a church ruled over by an Italian pope. Here indeed was a God-given opportunity to organize a purified Catholic Church, which would present the gospel to the people as did the primitive church, and exercise authority according to the spirit of free America. Villatte suggested that the Presbyterian mission should be taken over by the Diocese of Fond du Lac as an old Catholic outpost. Bishop Brown, who was a broad-minded high churchman, replied that he had already heard of Villatte's mission work and that he would be glad to help the movement. He explained that this would promote good relations between the Protestant Episcopal and the old Catholic churches, which in Europe were doing so much to break down the power of the papacy. Loyson had already written to Villatte, asking him to come to Paris so that they could discuss the possibility of getting him ordained priest by Bishop Herzog at Bern. This would be the first step towards setting up an old Catholic church in North America. Villatte had replied that he did not want to abandon his little flock. He probably lacked the money to travel to Europe. The next step taken by Bishop Brown was to inform Villatte that he must be examined by two of the professors at Nashota on his theological knowledge. The result was satisfactory, and Dr. Brown wrote that he would consult some of his fellow bishops regarding Loyson's advice that Villatte should be ordained by Herzog. Word came on May 27, 1885, that these bishops had decided that this was the wisest course to follow, but Villatte was then told that the Standing Committee of the Fond du Lac Diocese was convinced that the Anglican succession of apostolic authority was preferable to that of the old Catholics. Therefore, it would be better for him to be raised to the priesthood by Dr. Brown. This would stress the sufficiency of Anglican ordinations in the USA, and also save time and expense. Lastly, it would help towards the knitting of a closer unity with the diocese from the beginning of the movement. On the receipt of this letter, Villatte went to Fond du Lac and told the bishop that he did not want to accept Anglican orders because this would prevent his mission work securing the support of the people. He insisted that testimonials should be given him to present to Bishop Herzog, and the following letter was written. My dear brother, permit me to introduce to your confidence and esteem the bearer of this letter, Mr. René Villatte, a candidate for holy orders in the Diocese of Fond du Lac. Mr. Villatte is placed in peculiar circumstances. Educated for the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church, he found himself unable to receive the recent Vatican decrees, and for a short time associated himself with the Presbyterian Communion, but at last, by the mercy of God, was led into contact with this branch of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. He resided for a while at Green Bay, a city of this diocese, in the neighborhood of this place, where there are settled about 30,000 Belgians. Of these, a large number, probably 8,000, are believed to be inclined to the principles of a pure and primitive Catholicism. Several delegations of these Belgians have waited on Mr. Villatte and besought him to become their priest. Mr. Villatte's character for piety, sobriety, purity, intelligence, and prudence has been attested to the satisfaction of the authorities of this diocese. Our canons, however, require a longer probation as a candidate that the exigency of the circumstances will bear. At the suggestion of Père Hyacinth Loyson, approved by the Bishop of Connecticut and other bishops, and by the faculty of Nashua Seminary, and by me, Mr. Villatte approaches you, requesting you to ordain him to the priesthood, as speedily as you can find possible, that he may enter upon the great work to which he seems specially summoned. It has been expedient to us to send him to you, that he may learn personally something of the aims and spirit of the great movement, of which you are a recognized leader, and to be fitted to cooperate with you in some degree in this country. Mr. Villatte's pecuniary means are limited, and he desires to be absent from this diocese as short a time as possible. I ask you to ordain him to the priesthood and attest his character, briefly but sufficiently, by saying that I am willing to ordain him, if it should not seem expedient to you so to do. Truly and lovingly your brother and servant in the Holy Church of our Lord, J. H. Hobart Brown, Bishop of Fond du Lac. Armed with this letter, Villatte arranged to return to Green Bay, confident that the road at last was clear, and so he planned to sail for Europe. But the bishop accompanied him to the railroad depot, and before the train started said, I will ordain you priest tomorrow if you will be satisfied with your ordination and rest here. To this Villatte replied, No, old Catholic I am, old Catholic I will be. Then came an assurance from the bishop that he would never be subject to the standing committee of the diocese. Even this did not satisfy Villatte, who, wasting no more time, was off to Switzerland as soon as he raised the money for the trip. He was ordained deacon and priest at Bern by Bishop Herzog on June 6th and 7th, 1885. According to his own statement, he did not take the usual oath of canonical obedience to a diocesan bishop, but Bishop Grafton, writing nearly 20 years after the event, said that he took a canonical oath of obedience to the Bishop of Fond du Lac. If Villatte's statement was true, then his ecclesiastical status remained undefined. In fact, the only episcopal superiors who could claim any sort of canonical authority over him were Bishop Herzog and Bishop Brown, for the Archbishop of Utrecht does not stand in any metropolitan relationship to the other old Catholic churches. This was to be the cause of much trouble in the near future. On his return to Wisconsin, Father Villatte opened a mission church for the Belgians at Little Sturgeon, Gardner. He dedicated it to the precious blood in order to stress that communion was given under both species. His first parish was located between two Roman Catholic churches. It appears that the House of Bishops of the Episcopal Church granted him permission to use the French version of the Swiss Christian Catholic liturgy, issued by Bishop Herzog in 1880. The chapel was built with money given by Episcopalians, and the priest in charge was paid a salary from the same source. Dr. Brown gave his imprimatur to a Catechisme catholique compiled by Villatte, which rejected the doctrines of the Immaculate Conception and papal infallibility, and laid down that the sacrament of penance was not obligatory. Later on, an old Catholic mission of the Blessed Sacrament was opened in the city of Green Bay. All went well for the next 3 years. In September 1887, the Fond du Lac Diocesan magazine referred to Villatte as the young pioneer priest of the old Catholic work in America, tall with a winsome countenance and enthusiastic manner, a model of a priest and pastor, a young man of energy and dignity, culture and education. He has sacrificed his life to the cause of old Catholic reform. We pray God to open the hearts and hands of churchmen all over the land to the aid of his noble work. By this time, the cultured young pioneer priest felt he needed an assistant to enable him to win over more papists to a purer and more primitive form of Catholicism. Mr. Gautier, whom he chose, had, like himself, been converted to Protestantism as a Catholic schoolmaster, and had been sent by Dr. Brown to Switzerland, where Bishop Herzog raised him to the diaconate and priesthood. On his return to the United States, Father Gautier was put in charge of the Old Catholic Church of the Blessed Sacrament at Green Bay. Villatte now had 3 parishes under his control: Little Sturgeon, Green Bay, and Dykesville. Bishop Brown died on May 22, 1888, and was, on November 13th, succeeded as Bishop of Fond du Lac by Charles Chapman Grafton, who had been one of the first members of the Society of St. John the Evangelist, the Cowley Fathers, founded at Oxford in 1866. Grafton was a somewhat rigid high churchman who had imbibed much of the austere spirituality of the founder of his community, the Reverend R. M. Benson. His social background had always been that of what used to be called a gentleman, and he had lived mainly among pious and eminently respectable people. For this reason, he did not at first suspect that behind the winsome countenance of the young priest of his diocese, who appeared to be laboring so heroically to convert Roman Catholics to Old Catholicism, was the brain of a mere adventurer, as he put it 21 months later. It can be understood that the apostolate to which Villatte was devoting himself made a special appeal to Grafton, who had a lifelong fear and detestation of the growing power of the papacy, and did everything possible to combat it. Realizing, however, that the old Catholic missions, of which it seems he thoroughly approved, were virtually a freelance affair, Bishop Grafton managed to persuade Villatte to transfer them legally to the trustees of the Diocese of Fond du Lac to be held in trust for Old Catholicism. In return for this, the trustees agreed to pay stipends to the priests and finance their work. So far as Villatte himself was concerned, this soon proved to be a fatal error. Yet, judging from the tone of the pamphlet he published in July 1889, and entitled A Sketch of the Belief of the Old Catholics, Villatte was still quite convinced that he had a vocation to be an Old Catholic mission priest in the United States. He explained to his readers that it was sufficient to demonstrate that Old Catholics are as removed from Protestantism on the one hand as they are from Romanism on the other. In a word, that they are Catholics without any other qualification. He played on American feelings, as he often did in after years, by stressing that the government of the Church ought to be democratic, unlike that of the Roman Church. He pointed out that Old Catholics recognize that religious orders are a source of strength and benediction not to be neglected, and as proof of this, he had founded what was actually the first Old Catholic religious community in the world, the Monastery of the Precious Blood at Dykesville, Kewaunee County, Wisconsin. Unfortunately, he tells us nothing about this institute, but he added the letters SPB to his name, as did the other 2 members. When Monsignor Heekamp, Old Catholic Archbishop of Utrecht, heard of what was going on in Wisconsin, he wrote to Villatte on September 19, 1889, urging him to break off all relations with the Protestant Episcopal Church. Since the Second Conference held at Bonn in 1875, the Dutch Old Catholics had been polite but distant towards Anglicans, whose orders they did not then recognize as valid. On October 8, 1889, Monsignor Dependal, Bishop of Deventer, wrote a strongly worded letter implying that the Old Catholic hierarchy in the Netherlands regarded Father Villatte, SPB, as one of their priests and the recognized leader of the Old Catholic movement in North America. The following April, Villatte told Grafton about the correspondence with the Church of Utrecht and suggested that he be raised to the episcopate. The Bishop of Fond du Lac hardly knew what to do, but he wrote to Archbishop Haycamp, "It would be open to you to proceed to consecrate him and send him to America as Episcopus Regionarius." He explained that there might be considerable opposition if Villatte were to be made an abbot bishop of the Society of the Precious Blood and given the rank of suffragan to the Bishop of Fond du Lac, adding that in this case he might be forced to leave his present position and begin work elsewhere. He would also be cut off from all financial support of every kind, as it is only through his connection with us and by reason of our commendation that he has been hitherto sustained. It would be very hard upon the people to lose the pastor to whom they are attached. Grafton then offered to transfer Villatte to the jurisdiction of either Haycamp or Herzog, but hinted that this would involve losing financial help from Episcopalian sources. It is clear that Grafton was now trying to rid himself of this difficult French priest, who showed no signs of settling down as one of the clergy of the Fond du Lac diocese. On August 8, 1890, he wrote to Archbishop Vladimir, the Russian Orthodox bishop of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, who resided at San Francisco, and said, "Mr. Villatte, who has had a strange history, has shown little steadfastness of purpose, except in trying to push himself into prominence. Having given the Archbishop, unsuccessfully as it happened, a brief summary of all the worst aspects of Villatte's career, he ended his letters with the words, 'It is a sad pity that a man who, if he applied himself steadfastly to his work, might be a useful priest, shows so many qualities of a mere adventurer.' Thus, after 21 months, the former Cowley father summed up Villatte's character. He was then aged 35 and extremely good-looking, with an irresistible charm of manner, and at least a veneer of piety. It is not surprising that Grafton was fascinated by his personality and accepted him at his face value. But now he was on the warpath, and in September 1890 he circulated a warning which was printed in all the newspapers of the Episcopal Church. Readers were asked not to send any more contributions to the old Catholic mission of Dykesville. The bishop stated that the Reverend R. Villatte had been, during the past year, seeking to obtain the episcopate at the hands of the Church in Holland. Failing this, he applied to Bishop Vladimir, asking to be admitted into the Orthodox Eastern Church. Lately I discovered that he was making proposals to the Roman Catholic bishop at Green Bay with a view to return to Rome. This last accusation was true, for on August 15, 1890, Villatte had written to Monsignor Katzer, Bishop of Green Bay, saying, "Being finally determined not to agree with the 39 Articles of the Episcopal Church, I insist on what I have already published in the English papers. We are accordingly determined never to become Protestants, and would prefer to see our people under the rule of Rome, rather than to see them turn Protestant, no matter of what form or color." But the Bishop of Green Bay was too cautious to open his arms wide to this lapsed Catholic. All he could suggest was that the first step would be for Villatte to retract publicly and then retire to a religious house under probation. After this, it would rest with the Holy See to judge whether the orders conferred by Bishop Herzog were valid, and to prescribe what further theological studies were necessary. Whether it would be prudent for him to remain at Dykesville or even in the Diocese of Green Bay could be settled later. Villatte answered the letter at once in a non-committal manner, and nothing materialized. He had no intention of doing penance. Meanwhile, over in Europe, Archbishop Haycamp and some of his clergy had been urging Villatte to cast aside the Episcopalian yoke and to free himself of all pretense of being under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Fond du Lac. They assured him that there would be little difficulty in arranging for his episcopal consecration. Early in September 1890, Bishop Grafton, accompanied by several of his clergy, visited the parish of Duval. The local ordinary was both surprised and indignant when the pastor informed him that there were no candidates for confirmation because the old Catholic bishops of Holland had forbidden him to accept any sacraments from a Protestant prelate. Nevertheless, Grafton insisted on addressing the congregation, stressing that he was their true bishop and reminding them of all the financial help they had received from him. The same scenes were repeated the following day at Father Gauthier's church at Little Sturgeon, where once again the bishop bishop was told that he could not confer the sacrament of confirmation. Shortly after this stormy visitation, Grafton wrote to Vallot, insisting that he should give up his work and hand over the properties to the diocesan authorities, including all house furniture, altar vessels, and vestments. He ended his long letter with the words, "A clergyman, entrusted as you are by me over the people at Dykesville, is bound to instill into them love and loyalty to me and to the church which I represent. If he cannot, then he is bound to go, and in the meantime say nothing that would unsettle them or lead them to Rome or away from their allegiance to me." On September 19th, Vallot informed Grafton that he felt it his duty to sever his connection with the Episcopal Church. The bishop replied that in order to effect this canonically, it would be necessary for Vallot to state in writing that he had renounced the ministry of the said church to the bishop, of which he had made his oath of canonical obedience when he was ordained. It is probable that Grafton made an error in stating that Vallot had taken an oath of obedience to his predecessor when Bishop Herzog raised him to the priesthood in Switzerland. As a proof that he no longer accepted the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Fond du Lac, Vallot opened a new mission station near Green Bay. On hearing of this, the bishop inhibited him until he had obtained authorization. On October 30th, he informed this now freelance priest that Bishop Herzog had written that there was no necessity or even possibility of giving a bishop to the Old Catholics in the United States. Grafton commented that the Old Catholics of Europe have no right to interfere over here. If the Bishop of Rome has not, certainly the Archbishop of Utrecht has not. Grafton appears to have believed firmly that the Protestant Episcopal Church was the only true Catholic Church in North America, and that it had exclusive territorial jurisdiction. At that date, he could not even find room for the three-branch theory of the Catholic Church, and he regarded the Roman Catholic hierarchy in the United States as schismatics, and probably as heretics. After the Old Catholic Congress held at Cologne in September 1890, the bishops had decided that it was expedient to carry out the consecration of Vallot as their only official representative in the United States. It was not until 1897 that they appointed Stanislaus Kozlowski as the first Old Catholic bishop for North America, with a roving commission over groups of scattered Poles. Realizing that he had been rejected by both the Episcopalians and the Old Catholics, Vallot appealed to Bishop Vladimir for the second time. The latter replied that he would communicate at once with the Holy Synod of Moscow, and if no answer was received, after a reasonable time, he would reordain him sub conditione and receive him as a priest of the Russian Orthodox Diocese of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. Matters dragged on until February 20th, 1891, when Grafton informed Vallot that he had been removed from the mission station of St. Mary's, Dykesville. Vladimir, on hearing of this, assured Vallot of his support and urged him to fight against impostors who changed the authority of the ecumenical councils on the authority of private opinions, and because sectarians and nihilists inside of Christendom, because they annihilate the one true, only Catholic Orthodox Church. Moreover, he promised to write a pastoral to the Old Catholics, defending Vallot's Christian piety. On March 11, 1891, the Bishop of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska dispatched from San Francisco an impressively worded letter addressed to the pious Old Catholic parishioners and trustees of the church at Dykesville, in which he said that it was a great joy for them to be a branch of the great body of Jesus Christ and members of the Church of Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople, where are the seats and cathedrals of patriarchs and holy synods of the ecumenical Orthodox Church. It would be a great honor to have their pious disposition to be brave soldiers of Christ. Bishop Vladimir also asked God to help them to defend Christian truth against the errors of Papist and Protestant sectarians who do not belong to the true Catholic Church of Christ and must disappear in time like many other heresies.